right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session of Wonk Week. My name is Maggie McKee, and I am a solutions engineer here at Quorum. We'll give folks another minute or two to join the call, and then we'll go ahead and get started. As people are joining, thank you everybody for joining. Hope that you have enjoyed Wonk Week so far. We are happy to have you here and appreciate you joining. All right, I see our count slowing down. So let's go ahead and get started. Once again, my name is Maggie, and I am here with my friends Seth and Ashley to discuss building your policy communications plan and then training your team to execute it. But before we dive in, I want to share a few housekeeping items. Specifically, first and foremost, this session will be recorded, and the recording and slides will be distributed at the end of the event. Second, on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a chat box and a Q&A submission form. We would encourage you to use the chat throughout the session to share insights, submit your questions in Q&A as you think of them. And then we'll go through the questions at the end of the presentation. So we will hold most of those questions until the end for Seth and Ashley. And with that, let's dive in. I am excited to be joined here by Ashley Durkin-Rixey and Seth Nelson. Ashley is a senior director at Glen Echo Group, where she uses her extensive experience in media relations and public affairs with technology clients seeking to connect their corporate mission with public policy. And before joining Glen Echo Group, she was the director of communications for ACT, the App Association, where she led communication strategy on policy issues affecting small business app developers, such as privacy and security, competition, and intellectual property. So thanks for joining us today, Ashley.
Glad to be here.
And then Seth Nelson is a vice president at Frontwood Strategies, where he specializes in overall communication strategy, messaging, national and local earned media placements, and speech writing and opinion writing. Seth has worked on a variety of issues from education, housing, climate change, democracy reform, trade policy, and LGBTQ plus equality. Prior to Frontwood Strategies, Seth served as the communications director for the Maine Democratic Party and also worked at SKD Knickerbocker. So with that, thank you, Seth, for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Ashley, I will turn it over to you if you can get us started.
Absolutely. As Maggie mentioned, I'm Ashley Durkin-Rixey. So a little bit more about my career. I have worked in public affairs communications for nigh 20 years now, most of my career in DC. So I have seen everything, I feel like, in watching things change over the years. Public affairs was not something that I sought out to be a part of. I studied PR, communications, but my first ever job in DC was with an issues and advocacy PR firm. And I really fell in love with the idea of communicating broader stories, broader missions, bringing in the stakeholders that seem outside, looking at new issues. And public affairs gives you a really, really good chance to work across a number of divisions. I like to say that communications is the mortar between the bricks of government affairs, regulatory, and legal. And it's kind of one of those, if it happens in a forest and no one's around to hear it, that's where us comms people come in. We have to make sure people hear things. And I think the biggest challenge that we face in terms of building a policy comms strategy and executing on it is not bringing in your internal stakeholders early. You want to work with your government affairs or regulatory. If you're at a trade association, your membership department, where are your state people, grassroots, all of these things touch your communication strategy. And the sooner you can bring in your subject matter experts from other internal stakeholders, the faster you'll get to the things that are really important, like how do we translate this message out of Wonk language? That's what we're here for. It's Wonk Week. How do we put it into things that the average human can understand? And then two, your audience and the appropriate channels. You're going to speak to media on an issue very differently than you do policymakers. And even facing things like Congress is a very different experience than, say, an agency like the Federal Trade Commission. It's all a different experience. And so relying on the subject matter experts you have internally that are familiar with the non-media or non-external communication stakeholders, they can really help you develop a strategy that's very pinpointed, so you make sure you're getting to the people that you need. Another thing I want to bring up is audience. I think a lot of public affairs campaigns kind of spin their wheels explaining, what the other side thinks. And I kind of look at it as three sides. You've got your champions who are with you on your issue. That's the reason you're putting out this campaign, or it's because of something like, say, people that may be against your policy, against the public affairs issue that you're talking about. Both of those sides have made up their minds. The people you want to look at is what I like to call the mushy middle. It's the neutral folks. Those are the ones that you need to look at and push. And I think any of us that have worked, especially in federal public affairs and worked with Congress, know there's a lot more members of Congress that don't have a stance on an issue than there are that do, especially with really niche issues that may not come up in their committee assignments, just might not be on their radar. We also know staff turns over really fast. So getting those messages in an easy to understand way to staff, to congressional leaders that have not approached an issue before, you don't want to dive in immediately with, here's some legislative text. You want to work on the background of the issue. And that's where we as public affairs communications professionals are really assistive to lobbying groups, government affairs, regulatory people that are actually having these face-to-face meetings. I think that mushy middle is really what drives your needle. You can see if you were able to make more champions, if people aren't converting to another side, those are good wins. It takes forever to pass legislation or to have movement on a policy issue. It's a lot of fighting individual battles to win an overall lost my train of thought, is to win an overall issue area. So that's a really important one to keep in mind. And then next is your media. Think beyond the Beltway. When you're working on policy issues, there are plenty of publications beyond the usual congressional rank and file you could talk to. I think, having come out of the trade association world, trade pubs are great. It's a lack of something sometimes that many of them have in an industry. They don't have people who are covering what's happening in Washington every day. And so trade pubs can provide a really good area to own thought leadership in an issue. So think about bringing new audiences into the Beltway as you build your plan. And then the most important thing is look at your team. Some of us have worked on big teams. Some of us have been solo practitioners. Don't be afraid to say, I can't do it all. Here's where I need assistance. And especially from those other internal stakeholders you may be involved with, or it's your client, really make sure that this is a group effort, because intelligence comes from them. You see the tactics being executed by them. And it's really important to make sure that you're checking in with those folks, especially when it comes to media. To give an example, one of my favorite public affairs campaigns I ever worked on was when I was at the Entertainment Software Association. They are the trade association for video game publishers and developers. So super exciting work as someone who's a gamer. But we had a long gestating case that went before the Supreme Court, and it was my first experience with how do you create a comms strategy for the court. And it was very challenging because you had to think not just about the core clutch of people that cover the Supreme Court in DC, the Beltway. We also had to think about gamers and gamers in other countries who weren't familiar with the First Amendment. And this was a First Amendment case to kind of sell the story of here's why we're out here fighting. So, one of the most interesting things in that was the media relations. You had about 15 to 20 people who covered the Supreme Court's ins and outs every term, who understood all the legal background in this, but had no experience with video games. And many of them had not even seen the video games that were being brought into question in this case. And then you had the gamer media, which understood the game side, but had no idea why this was at the Supreme Court and what an outcome could mean. So it was a lot of specialized channel tactics to educate individual audiences rather than just going for a mass play where we're speaking to everyone with the same broad message. And then if you've ever done litigation or crisis, you know that your rapid response is the core of your effort. And making sure down to little things, because Supreme Court verdicts tend to be wire reports, they come out things, making sure your spokespeople are in the articles, especially as they develop throughout the day, correcting things, down to having your name wrong in it, but making sure they're out front and center, that someone is constantly prepping your spokespeople with any changes to the messaging that you might be adjusting on the fly because of media coverage or feedback from stakeholders. So it's really important to think about this as a live exercise. You don't just make your strategy and it goes. You have sort of a finite amount of time around a story or an issue area that you really need to move it in because we're all fighting for space. And I think the key to successful policy comms here is really thinking about it just beyond DC and making sure that when you get down to your tactics, they're specialized and you have somebody in charge of each vertical and taking care of everything, and that you're making sure any progress is being reported up so that everyone has the latest that they can respond to, especially when you're in more of a crisis or high profile situation.
Ashley, thank you so much. That is incredible insight. I especially love the mushy middle. I think that's a new one, and I love it. It makes perfect
Please, fair use, everyone take it.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Ashley. Seth, I am going to go ahead and hand it over to you. Seth is going to take us to get a little bit more in the weeds. Now that you are committed to incorporating a media and communication strategy, how do you train your executives to execute it? Seth, we want those answers. We want you to teach us.
Well, thank you very much. I've got some slides here to help guide this conversation, but thanks so much, Maggie, for having me here today. As she mentioned earlier, my name is Seth Nelson. I'm a vice president at Frontwood Strategies. I have worked with organizations and their leaders to develop their communication strategies from the big picture down to the smallest details. And so today, I'm going to really focus on one of the most important details of any communication strategy, your spokespeople. The time a leader has in the spotlight is really important. And so in the limited time that I have here today, I'm going to give you some tips to help you prepare your spokespeople to be ready for those engagements. And I'm going to talk about what I consider the hardest type of public engagement. That's the live TV interview. Because if your spokespeople are ready for that, they can really do anything from present at an event to sharing their story on a recorded video. Your spokesperson's job is to deliver a message, not have a conversation. So my goal here today is to give you the tools to help you train your spokespeople to effectively persuade your audience and move them to action. So I'm going to review 3 areas of focus. First, I'll talk about getting in the right headspace and exploring what it really means to be an organization spokesperson. Second, we'll review how you can develop a roadmap for messaging. And third, being a spokesperson is more than what you actually say, it's also how you say it. So we'll review some tips and tricks to ensure that your spokesperson's presentations achieve your goals. So let's just jump right in. Your leader should be comfortable sharing your vision for achieving your mission. That said, it isn't always natural to look natural on camera. And there are tendencies that we all have as human beings that can get in the way of delivering a clear and compelling message. So I want to start actually by talking a little bit about strategy. Organizations should be seeking out media coverage to advance your goals, whether they're operational or advocacy goals. But before agreeing to any interview, you need to set your objectives and target audiences, as Ashley talked a little bit about in her presentation. So for example, are you trying to recruit participants to a program? Are you trying to change legislation before a city council? Knowing that before you go in is going to help you determine what opportunities advance your objectives, and it's also going to inform the messaging that you write. After you've set your strategic objectives and audiences, it's important to get your spokespeople in the right mindset for an interview. So oftentimes we will encounter leaders who are very nervous about doing media interviews or speaking to large groups. They'll get overwhelmed thinking, what questions are they going to throw my way? Am I going to succeed in this setting? If your leaders find themselves asking you those same questions, remind them that they are the expert. That is why they have this interview opportunity, and they are in control. As a spokesperson, their job is to deliver a message and to persuade their audience to action. So who is the audience? Let's dig deeper into that a little bit. Remember, in an interview, the media is a conduit to your audiences that you care about. The participants want to sign up for your program, the new donors that you want to introduce to your organization, or the lawmakers that you're trying to persuade to action. So rather than focus on the reporter that's sitting in front of you, you should be training your spokespeople to tailor their delivery and message to the audience that's at home that will ultimately watch the final product. And that requires setting aside your normal interpersonal communications habits and to build your spokesperson skills. Being prepared is the most important part of any interview. So I've already mentioned, as communications professionals, your best strategy is to accept and pursue media opportunities that advance your organizational goals to reach your target audiences. So that means having your goal and knowing what you're trying to make your audience do. But as you prepare your spokespeople for that opportunity, play to their strengths, know what their comfort zones are, and set them up for success. Remember, your spokespeople are in control of any dynamic that they find themselves in, including a live TV interview. And being in control in this case means being on message. They should remain focused on the audience, not the reporter. So I've told you a few things that your spokespeople should be prepared to do, but I also want to talk about some things that they should not do. So first, your spokespeople don't need to accept the premise of questions in an interview. Ask questions to elicit specific responses, but your spokespeople should be focused on your plain message. Remember, this is not a test. Second, your spokespeople don't need to know everything. It is totally fine to say, I'll have to get back to you. It's better to get back to them than to be wrong. So as long as they've done their job of delivering the quotable soundbite that you want, you can always send reporters additional background information that they might need afterwards. Your spokespeople also don't need to fill time. I personally like to schedule interviews for about 10 to 15 minutes because that is plenty of time for a spokesperson to deliver a soundbite. The more that your spokesperson says, the give a reporter, the greater the possibility of diverting from the message that you came to deliver. Finally, your spokespeople don't need to educate the reporter. You should assume that they already have the background or that you've already talked about that beforehand and start with your sound bites. You can, again, always follow up later with additional background information that they might need. All right, I've mentioned messaging several times. You need to work with your spokespeople ahead of time to create a roadmap to make sure that your message is clear, concise, and most importantly, flexible. So let's start with the basics. Your message isn't just about one interview or one single speech. Your message is your whole campaign. Your message is how you articulate the direction and purpose of your organization. Effective messages are going to connect to the shared values between you and your audience on the other side of the camera. Memorable messaging is concise, resonant, and emotive, and it should be personal, relevant, and most importantly, repeated so that your audience remembers after the interview ends. So I'm going to introduce you to the message triangle framework, which will help you distill your argument down to the basics of persuasion. You may have seen this before, but we're going to run through this. The message triangle has 4 parts. At the top, we focus on the problem and defining what is wrong. This allows us to frame the argument on our terms. On the bottom left, the solution, we focus on the solution and what we will do to address the problem. This is where we're going to discuss our programs or our policy agenda. On the bottom right, we focus on the visualization. This is where we talk about what's at stake. And here you can motivate your audience with hope or fear, depending on what the action is that you're wanting them to take. And finally, in the middle, we articulate our core values. This is where we discuss why you're doing what you do, and we use emotion here to connect to our audience. Each section of the triangle should be about 1 to 2 sentences and written in such a way so that the points flow smoothly from part to part. You should also avoid jargon and weighing down your messaging with too many anecdotes or statistics. Your spokespeople need to be able to memorize this and deliver it naturally and authentically. But once you have this message framework down, you can teach your spokespeople not to focus too much on the actual specific questions that a reporter is going to ask. Your job, remember, is to deliver a message. So they're going to deliver the points on your message triangle repeatedly and authentically in the interview. Going back to the live TV interview, they tend to be very short, often just a matter of minutes, and they could be interrupted really at any point for breaking news. So keeping that in mind, your spokespeople should be prepared to say your full message, all 4 elements of the triangle, as the response to the first question, no matter what. That way, even if they're cut off, they've successfully delivered your whole message, and that is a win. For subsequent questions, you can anticipate which point on the triangle best aligns with the question so that you can balance being responsive with your goal of delivering the message. So I'm just going to give you an example of this in action. This example is for a nonpartisan voter registration organization. This simple message can be read in any order. So I'm just going to start by going kind of around the triangle, problem, solution, visualization, core, and just read through it. Our democracy works best when it reflects the will of the people, and that means we all need to register and vote. You can register by September 1st online, in person at your local library, or at our festival next weekend. Your vote counts, and it's one of the most important ways to take action and make your voice heard. There is so much at stake in our elections, and that's why I'm registering my family, friends, and neighbors to vote this fall. It can also work if you flip it around. So I'm going to start with the core and go kind of reverse. Core, solution, visualization, problem. There's so much at stake in our elections, and that's why I'm registering my family, friends, and neighbors to vote this fall. You can register by September 1st online, in person at your local library, or at our festival next weekend. Your vote counts. It's one of the most important ways to take action and make your voice heard. Our democracy works best when it reflects the will of the people, and that means that we all need to register and vote. Now, this is a pretty simple triangle, and it can be said by anybody. We can improve on this by making it more personal to the spokesperson. So, for example, I could talk about my first experience, voting and how it made me feel. I could also add an anecdote about a volunteer for the organization or a member of the community I'm trying to organize. I could also add a statistic about how many eligible voters are not registered in the community. These layers of detail that you add can be refined into sound bites that are quotable, and they can be jotted kind of on the outside of the triangle under which section they belong the most in. But just be careful as you add more detail. Your quote in a TV news piece might only be a few seconds long. So going back to our voting organization example, if a journalist asks how people can register, the solution is probably the best response, and you can just say that. Or if a reporter asks why the organization is launching a voter registration drive, maybe you just want to say the problem and the core and use that as your response. So you can see by drawing on different points of the triangle, you can repeat the message without coming off as robotic or evasive. Now, your spokespeople won't need to run through your message triangle in every single response. It doesn't always warrant it. But another way to think about how to respond is to use an ABA structure. And essentially this means start with your values and end with your values, and in between, support with your evidence and other message points. So going back to our example, that could be something like this. There's a lot at stake in our elections, and that's why I'm registering my family, friends, and neighbors to vote this fall. You can register by September 1st online, in person at your local library, or at our festival next weekend. Your vote counts, and it's one of the most important ways to take action and make your voice heard. So we got the message point in the middle where we told people how to register to vote and when to register to vote, and couched it in our values. It's possible that an interview, though, could take a different turn. So for example, if our voter registration spokesperson is asked about a specific candidate, they shouldn't answer that question because they're a nonpartisan organization, but you don't want to lose the audience. And that's where we turn to a strategy called bridging, which is how we can respond to an off-topic question or comment and bring it back to our message. So going back to our example, our spokesperson could say, I can't comment on the candidates on the ballot, but what I can say is that everyone should be registered by September 1st to be able to vote for the candidate of their choosing. And then from there, you can connect with another message point and redirect the conversation. Flagging is another technique. So if you straight from your triangle, you could say something like, before we go, I want to say that the most important thing about this is. That's just a really another useful tool to be able to get back to your message and also signal to your audience that you were about to say something very important. All right, so we've talked about the message. Let's talk about delivering this actual message now that you've got it ready to go. So we're talking about television. It's a visual medium. It's how your spokesperson looks and sounds is essential to delivering your message and connecting with your audience. Video cameras, unfortunately, distort our bodies, and we transform from 3-dimensional to 2-dimensional. And the camera lens is also going to exaggerate the tiniest movements. These strategies will help eliminate distractions and help you connect with the audience on the other side of the lens. So first, let's talk about visual strategies. Consider your spokesperson's posture. It's important that they start with a strong core, have them sit up straight and on the edge of their seat with feet flat on the ground. That way they're exuding better energy than slouching in the back of the chair. Now, as polite people, we often nod along to signal that we're listening. On TV, though, that visual cue could signal agreement. So you want to make sure that your spokesperson's head remains still. And if they do decide to move it, it needs to be done with intention. Next, eye contact. It's one of your spokesperson's most powerful tools. It's how they can really build trust and a connection with your audience. So looking up signals that they're looking for help, and looking down signals that they're not confident. So to the best of their ability, you should maintain eye contact with the camera lens, or maintain eye contact with the reporter if the shot is set up at an angle. The camera lens can also take a normally neutral expression and turn it into a frown. So try to fight that urge by using a slightly upturned mouth to help convey the good story that you have to tell. Many people also talk with their hands. I'm one of them. So try to keep those gestures, though, low and open so that they don't become distracting. That's especially true when you're on a Zoom camera like this, where your hands can kind of come up into the frame and they don't look like they're connected to you. So always be aware of that. Also avoid clenching your fist or clutching the arms of your chair. That kind of signals that you're nervous or angry to the audience. Finally, many people are often not sure what to wear on camera. Avoid fine patterns as they tend not to translate well on camera. Also avoid wearing jewelry that moves, like dangling earrings, as that could become a distraction on a small screen. And also avoid wearing transition lenses that change under bright lights. Your spokesperson's vocal tools are also an essential element of your presentation. So make sure that they remember to slow down, remember to pause, and remember to punctuate their sentences with their voice. Your spokesperson knows the message that they're there to deliver, but it might be the first time that your audience is hearing it. So it's really important that they slow down so that the audience can actually absorb what you're saying. Finally, as your spokesperson internalizes your message, consider where to place emphasis and how it can change the meaning of what you're saying. This is one of my favorite examples for how you can say a sentence in 6 different ways by putting different emphasis on different words, and it totally changes the meaning. I did not steal that woman's red purse. She did. I did not steal the woman's red purse. I did not steal the woman's red purse. I borrowed it. I did not steal the woman's red purse. I stole the man's red purse. I did not steal the woman's red purse. I stole her purple purse. I did not steal the woman's red purse. I stole her jacket. So you can see just by placing emphasis on different words that it completely changes the meaning of the sentence. So make sure that you're intentional when you're placing emphasis on words. All right, this should come without saying, but your spokesperson should practice delivering your message out loud to ensure a smooth delivery. They should practice in a mirror or ideally by recording themselves on video so that they can also practice their visual and vocal skills as well. Also, when you're working with your spokespeople, you should spend time role-playing an interview out loud with them. The 3rd or 4th time that you deliver a message is always going to be better than the first. So practicing this scenario is key. Before the interview, you should always know the details so that you can appropriately prepare your spokespeople. Who's going to be there? What's the format? Is it live or recorded? How long is the interview? And you can almost always anticipate the questions that a reporter is going to ask so that you can be prepared to respond within the message framework that you've already developed. And they almost always fall into very simple who, what, when, where, why, and how categories. The message framework that you have prepared to deliver your message is going to help you to deliver that message no matter what the question is. And finally, I'll say it again, practice, practice, practice out loud and often so that you're ready. Once you've prepared your spokesperson for the live interview, the most difficult type of interview, you're going to find that these techniques really work for any other type of engagement. That includes panels that happen in real life. Remember to check your posture on stage and on Zoom. Remind your spokespeople to always remember where your camera is so that they can look confident and minimize visual distractions that can come on a small screen. And at a podium, make sure your spokespeople keep their energy up to fully engage the audience. And finally, in a big room, make sure your spokespeople aren't constantly looking down at their notes. Instead, choose a couple of spots behind your audience to look, giving folks the impression that you're making eye contact with them as you scan the room. And finally, I'll say that as a communications professional, you should always remember that successful spokespeople continually build their profiles and practice the skills and strategies covered here today. And so some of the best ways that you can help build your spokesperson's profile is by making sure that you capture and publish video clips of them speaking to reporters or at events. TV producers and event organizers want to know that your spokespeople are great on camera, so make their job easy for them. And finally, you want to ensure that you continually show your spokesperson's expertise to journalists and event organizers. And one really easy way to do that is by being active on social media. You can even publish the clips that you've collected on social media to show their expertise. So I've covered a lot in a short period of time. I'm confident that you're ready to prepare your spokespeople for their time in the spotlight, though. But I will just say, if you'd like some additional support or training, Frontwood Strategies is available for message development, for one-on-one live trainings, for workshops, for teams, and also for comprehensive communication strategy. So I'm going to turn it back over, but thank you for having me here today, and feel free to reach out to me at seth@frontwoodstrategies.com if there's anything we can do to support you.
Seth, thank you so much for the great insights and the slide deck that you prepared. We now have time to take questions for both Seth and Ashley. So please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will go through any questions as we receive them. All right, we do have a question from the audience. So getting in the ideal publication is hard. What's the bar for when you'll accept a placement, even if it is not the ideal audience? Maybe we will. Ashley,
well, I'm happy to take that, but Seth, I think you'd agree it depends on the spokesperson. If the spokesperson is still ideal for that audience and the message is right, you take those placements. Like, we know that it's so competitive right now. It is hard to get into tier one. And the other thing about looking at some of these maybe not ideal audiences, that's how you build up reporter relationships. You work with someone while they might be at a small niche publication, and then 2 years from now, they're at a Politico or The Hill. You know, those things matter. It's just make sure you're right sizing the opportunity. If it's not an ideal audience, you may not need your CEO or a really heavy hitter, just a well trained spokesperson on that issue.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I don't have much to add there.
Amazing. We have another question from Jessica in the chat, specifically for you, Seth. For virtual presenting, external cameras are typically attached above the computer screen, of course. So should spokespeople look at their screen where their notes are or straight into the monitor camera?
I mean, ideally for an interview, or if you're doing, some kind of Zoom interview or live thing, it is better to look straight into the camera. And there are ways that you can kind of get around if you need some notes. They have what are they called? What's the thing that scrolls? I'm forgetting the name of it. That you can kind of put at the top of your. Thank you, teleprompter. That you can put kind of right below your camera, so it does look a little bit like you're looking at the camera. But going back to our message triangle framework, if you've got that ready and you've practiced and you're ready to go, you probably don't need your notes, and it's better to not rely on them in that kind of situation, and to be prepared to look at a camera. Now, that's easier said than done. I didn't look at my camera the entire time I was presenting today, but being as prepared as possible and doing that practice more and more, especially if you're doing an interview for TV and maybe that's happening over Zoom, which is all something that we've adjusted to in the last couple of years. I would definitely recommend looking right into the camera versus looking at your notes on the screen, because you can tell. I mean, you can see I've switched back and forth just doing this to kind of show what it looks like. So it's always better to look into the camera if you can.
Amazing. Thank you, Seth. Excellent question that we have here in the chat. Do either of you have any advice for coaching a spokesperson that does not think they need coaching?
That's a great question.
I would say one thing, especially when I'm working with new spokespeople. So you're at an organization and they have someone coming into a position. Record them talking, record them presenting internally. That's really where you begin. And just show, hey, let's work on, we're building you up to this for media. So let's begin by looking at just you presenting to us. You do have to gently walk it, and it can be hard. There will always be unpredictable spokespeople sometimes, but I think if you come at it from I am here to help you place, and you start it early with small foundations, it goes a long way.
Yeah, I think that's right. Recording, maybe if you can even get them to just record one interview so that you can practice the specific interview that they're wanting to go into, and you can have some questions prepared and can record, and then together you can look at it and kind of critique where things might get, where things could be better. And you can also kind of show them some examples of maybe someone who does it really well, and just say, we want to make you as good as possible for this engagement. Amazing. Recording, though, always a great tool in that.
Thank you both. Ashley, what advice do you have for introducing yourself to new reporters to build key relationships?
This is one of my favorite questions, because this is something I've really devoted a lot of time to, and I love passing my knowledge on to other people. Number one is ask them what they're working on. It's a two-way conversation. Start that conversation not with a need or an expectation of coverage. Start it with, hey, I noticed you're covering X beat, or you're new to this publication. Can we get a coffee, chat virtually to just see what are you interested in and how can I be helpful? And I also really encourage you, when you're working with media, also think of yourself as a connector. Maybe they're looking for a source that is not your client, your spokesperson. Connect them to someone you may know. That really helps build relationships with people. We're all in this together. We know how public affairs, media, and we work together. And the more you can approach it from a, hey, I really want to get to know you. So when I'm pitching you, I'm not sending you stuff you're not interested in. And also make it a regular check-in. I always find that the end of the year is a great time to ask people, "Hey, what are you thinking about writing next year? What's big for you?" Definitely have that conversation, and don't forget to talk about what you're following too.
Awesome. Seth, same question for you. What advice would you have for introducing yourself and building new relationships?
Coffee. Love getting together with reporters over coffee and getting to know them. I will just add what Ashley said, asking them what they're writing about, telling them some things, going into a meeting with something is great. Whether it's news that's coming up or whether news that you might be breaking, if that's something you want to give to them, or just like telling them what you're working on. Just doing your best to get to know them personally and invite them to coffee and to have that kind of just build that relationship from the ground up. That way, when they do have something or when they have, a story they're working on that maybe someone at your organization or your spokesperson might be right for, they're going to reach out to you at that point because they have a relationship with you.
And just to add in, there's a reverse side to this, which is when you were new at an organization or new on a client team, introduce yourself to their reporters from the same part. Use your own newness to start making connections.
Absolutely.
All right, we've got another question in the chat from Wendy. Wendy says, we've done some articles in electronic daily news that state legislators get. Are these generally good options? Do you find legislators generally read types of daily news that go out to all legislators?
I think state legislators in particular are having a moment right now. We're seeing the states legislate on a lot of things, particularly in the sector I work on in tech, faster than the federal government. So it's a critical audience right now. And those are really good. And those kind of things that are going to state legislatures can help you get in with state papers. Don't underestimate how important, if an issue is happening in a state, local news or things that are going to state legislators, how important they can be. And also, if you're working with a government affairs team, you can also leverage those articles that go out to state legislators by sending them as a package to their federal counterparts to say, hey, we've been talking to folks in your state about this issue. They may ignore it, but it helps show we're in your district talking about this.
Excellent. Seth, anything to add to
I think, anytime you can get in those small publications that state legislators get, and yes, you should always be trying as many different outlets. As Ashley mentioned earlier, getting into media is getting harder and harder. So if there are alternative methods of getting in front of them, absolutely take it.
Amazing. Seth, question for you. How can we encourage spokespersons, particularly researchers inclined to share detailed background information, to adopt concise messaging when they're reluctant to deliver brief statements or engage in advocacy?
I think it really goes back to talking to them about what the goals of a media engagement are, right? The goal is not to show that you know every single thing about this issue. It's about persuading someone. And so if they can't understand what the researcher, the spokesperson is saying because it's not concise or it's too convoluted because they're an expert on the topic, you're not actually achieving your goal. And so I think it's really important to lay that foundation and make sure that you're on the same page about what the goal of any media engagement is, and reminding them that most people probably are not experts on their topic. And so it needs to be simplified as much as possible to get across the message that you're trying to deliver to move them to action. If they can't understand your message, they're not going to be persuaded to action, whatever that is. So I think just starting with the goal and making sure that you're on the same page there can really help go a long way to convincing them that you've got to make it concise and you've got to make it easily digestible for their audiences.
Thank you. Ashley, any additional insights?
Also think about the publications where they can nerd out. That's another option. Where can they, regulatory outlets, legal outlets. I work with a lot of people in the legal and regulatory space, and it's a very different call when we're talking to Politico versus Law 360. That's when they can get in those weeds because they're talking to someone who kind of speaks the same language.
All right. How about some tips for getting the media to bite on something you want them to be sharing?
It's got to be timely, right? I think probably one of the biggest reasons why reporters don't bite on a pitch that you send is because it's not timely for them to write about it right now. So always, making sure that you're on top of the news and finding those news hooks, whether it's some story that's that's come out that you can follow up on, whether that's an anniversary or some sort of trend that's happening that you can find to create a good news hook. Always be on the lookout for those things. Might even be as simple as creating an editorial calendar and knowing when all the important dates are throughout the year, starting with that, and then kind of keeping on top of the news to make sure you can layer those things in to really make sure that your pitch is timely.
And I would add to that also, one thing that I've been hearing often from reporters is they don't want issue primers. Many of them understand an issue. They're not looking for issue primers. They're looking for, what do you have to say about this? Don't explain, the challenges of AI and privacy to me. I already know that. We're reading the coverage. Come to me with your unique take on it.
Thank you both. Another question for both of you. How do you overcome resistance to a particular person, organization, issue based on the political climate?
That's a tough one. And I think, again, that's where you look at who's your audience? Who are you trying to speak to? Are you trying to shore up support from your base? So go to the outlets that might be covering that issue and more receptive to your viewpoint. Are you pushing back, or are you trying to convince some people in the middle? And that's where you kind of need to tailor your approach a little. There will always be people out there who will speak to your folks. It's just media is so diverse now. You just have to do a lot more sleuthing to find the right outlets and channels.
Yeah, and you might want to consider too whether the spokesperson that you have is the right messenger for whatever the issue is. If maybe you're working on some sort of public affairs campaign that has multiple organizations involved, and maybe your organization is not the right one to be speaking on the issue. Maybe it's another organization. So it's not just not just the outlet; it's also the messenger itself. So you've got to make sure that you're matching the message to the right messenger.
Excellent. I have a question for both of you. What advice would you give to somebody who is trying to stand up policy communications efforts? What are the first things you would recommend? And then what are the more advanced things that you would recommend as they get their feet under them?
Well, one of the first things I would recommend, whether you are starting a policy comms effort or you're walking into someone's policy comms shop, talk to your government affairs people right away. Speak to them to get the lay of the land. Get what's pressing for us over the next 30, 60, 90 days. Really get that info. Sit down and interview your internal stakeholders. Find out what they're experts about. What are they passionate about? How do they present? Sit in if they're giving presentations or they're doing webinars, so you really get to know what you're working with first and foremost. And then if this is something where maybe they have experience with policy comms, ask them what worked before, what didn't, How would you like to see things change? And also, what does a win look like to you? Is very important because then you can right size expectations of what your effort is able to deliver on.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think just always starting with what are their goals, right? That's a question I always love to ask clients when we're talking to them the first time. What are your goals for this engagement? What are your goals with this legislation or with this program? And starting from there and really just building your communications plan from scratch from there. Once you have your goals, then you can talk about what kind of strategies you want to achieve those goals. And then underneath those strategies, you can have a slew of tactics, whether that's, writing op-eds, trying to pitch stories on specific topics, whether it's, going to speak at an event that might have the audience that you care about. It's really just starting from those basics and always down to what are your goals and going from there. You can't really go the other direction. I feel like a lot of times people will come to us and say, oh, we want to get an op-ed in the New York Times. Well, everyone wants to get an op-ed in the New York Times, but is that really the best way to actually persuade people? Sure, persuade people times, but really let's start with what are your actual goals and what are the strategies and tactics that will help us to get there.
Seth, I think we lost you for just a moment. Do we have you back, Seth? Can you hear us all right, Seth?
I think I broke up a little bit there. Yeah, I
we
can
did
now.
lose you for a second. If you wouldn't
Okay.
mind repeating the last bit of your thought.
I don't know where I left off, but yes, just to sum up, always start with your goals and don't try to go tactics back to your goals. Start with the goals and then go down to your tactics.
Excellent. Thank you both. We have another question in the chat. How do you balance the way coverage is done and a slant that favors systems or entities that counter your own, particularly when we want to maintain good relationships with particular stakeholders?
You got to deep dive on your outlets just as much as you deep dive on your reporters, because there's the layer of the reporter, and then there's also their editor. And that editor is going to be thinking a little more with the outlet in mind. So think about, Reuters or a Bloomberg always has a stock ticker in their stories, or a Wall Street Journal. So they might be more interested in stories that impact the company that you can throw a little stock ticker next to. I think that's really difficult to overcome. And that's why, again, start looking where they aren't. Talk to someone else, not the person that they're talking to at that beat. Find a new path in, and then understand what outlet criteria is for publishing. Some places, they don't want to talk to big company spokespeople because they tend to just want to talk on off-record basis. See what you have to work with, what you're comfortable with, and proceed from there.
I think you said it.
I believe we have covered every question in our chat. Friendly reminder to our audience, if you have any lingering questions for Seth or for Ashley, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A section on the right-hand section of your screen. If we have no additional questions, I think we're coming up to the end of our time. Thank you to everybody who joined us. Thank you to Seth and Ashley. Our next session is coming up at 4 p.m. It's Advancing Your Government Relations Strategy at the Local Level with Carmen Boone, the Vice President of Public Affairs for Food Bank of New York City. To join, just stay put here on this page and the session will start at 4 p.m. But Seth, Ashley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having
me.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.